a student of mine carried out last year, looking at uncomfortable experiences in digital games. So there's been some previous work looking at negative emotions in gameplay. So there's been work on emotional challenge, so how games don't just kind of challenge us in terms of difficulty, but in terms of the emotional kind of dilemmas they give us. Emotionally moving moments, so this tends to be a sort of mix of positive and negative experience, the kind of sad but good kind of thing, and that's been done by some of the people in this room as well, including Julia, who just spoke to us. There's also been some interest from live-action role-playing games in that mix between positive and negative experience and how it kind of comes together in particular scenarios, and some interest in forms of positive discomfort in games such as Spec Ops: The Line that play with player expectations. But generally speaking, this work sort of suggests that negative emotions are definitely something that is a common part of gameplay, but they often focus on this mix of the negative and the positive. So what we wanted to do was look more explicitly at negative forms of emotion in terms of discomfort. So how does discomfort actually manifest in games? So primarily negative experiences, and what does that discomfort do to overall engagement? So what we did is we carried out an online survey. There were some clear kind of ethical considerations here where we realised we wanted to talk to people about their uncomfortable experiences, but we wanted to minimise any potential harm coming to our participants, and also on the researcher side. So Chad did some work, some desk research and some looking at reviews to narrow down to a set of games that had sort of tags relating to bits of discomfort, and came up with the three following games: Papers, Please, Darkest Dungeon and Fallout 4. And we explicitly decided not to include games that dealt with themes such as suicide and depression due to ethical reasons. And what we did is we asked players some questions in relation to something that happened in the game that made you feel uncomfortable. So we asked them to describe what it was, but also how they felt about it as well. We got 95 responses in total. The sample was primarily sort of biased towards male respondents, and that may be partly to do with how we advertised it on forums such as Reddit. But generally these were relatively experienced players that were targeted on the game forums related to each game. So we carried out a thematic analysis, and the first set of themes related to how discomfort manifests in games. The first theme is what we call the persistent pressure of uncertainty. So this is about how games essentially make people feel stressed and anxious because you're not really sure what's going to happen next, and you're kind of uncertain about whether you're going to succeed or fail. The next theme relates to failure in the sense of when plans don't necessarily pan out, so things don't go your way, and it's the aftermath of that, so how people feel after that's occurred. And that could be a mix of frustration, but also feelings such as feeling foolish, that they hadn't been able to succeed in what they were trying to do. The third theme is about loss, so this kind of relates probably a bit more closely to what Julia just presented. So it's about feeling attached to a character and then losing that character, and feeling sadness or possibly even guilt around that. The fourth theme we called great responsibility but with limited power. So this is sort of an interesting one because it's a combination of two things. So the thing about games is that they give us a lot of responsibility. We're the ones who fail in the game. We're the ones who have to make these decisions. But at the same time, they kind of constrain that by constraining our choices and what we're actually capable of doing. And the final theme is unwanted exposure to disturbing themes. So here, the focus was on situations or events that related to themes that people found particularly uncomfortable and weren't expecting them and didn't necessarily want to have to deal with them. So I'll give you some examples of those as we go through the different games. So this is Papers, Please. It's a game where you play a border guard in a fictional Eastern European sort of country, and your job is to either decide who to let in and who not to let in based on the various documentation that you're provided with. And in Papers, Please, we definitely saw a lot of this uncertainty and pressure. So one of the things the game does is it gradually increases the number of documents and the things you have to look at in order to let people in. So this was described as being highly stressful due to having to keep up with these changing rules. Another example of one of the themes is the aftermath of failure. So here, somebody is referring to a scenario where it was their child's birthday in the game, but due to not being successful in processing enough people, they ended up feeling destroyed as they were unable to provide this gift to their child. So it just made me picture someone telling this poor child who was scared and hungry and cold that his birthday is met with no gifts, and just it broke his heart and mine. So we're getting quite an intense reaction to a scenario in the game where the person feels like they've failed in this instance. Now, Darkest Dungeon is quite a different kind of a game. It's a dungeon crawler. You control a team of heroes that have to fight variously sort of horrifying kind of monsters and things. So it's quite big on its horror aesthetic, but it's also known for being notoriously difficult. So the challenge of this game is quite high. So we did see a lot of uncertainty there, but we also started to see things like the experience of loss. So here someone's talking about one of their heroes who they named Dismas, and saying they felt despair when they died, and then grief as they fled back to the hamlet. And then we also saw this kind of mixture of feeling responsible but not having much power. So if you haven't played the game, I'm about to tell you a spoiler, so please stick your fingers in your ears. But essentially, in Darkest Dungeon, there's a point in the game where you have to sacrifice one of your heroes in order to complete it. So you're faced with this horrible choice that players described as being really stressful and made them anxious, and they had this sense of overwhelming dread. So before, when a character died, it wasn't entirely my fault, but this time it was me, so I was the one killing them due to that particular choice. So again, you're provided with, this is your fault because you're the one carrying out that action, but the game is not giving you sort of any other way out of it. And then Fallout 4 is an RPG set in a it's a series of games set in a post-apocalyptic future after a nuclear war. So you fight kind of lots of different kind of mutants and things and explore this sort of vast wasteland. And in this game, we again saw that mix of responsibility and power. So here, the participant is talking about a situation in the game where they felt that they were forced into killing a character who had been a friend of theirs. So I felt the story forced me to kill him, as any other outcome would have been narratively undesirable. So I wanted to complete the game, and I went through with it, but it was horrible. What they felt was horror, guilt, and shame. And then in terms of unwanted exposure, in another instance in Fallout 4, there was a participant who talked about a particular character in the game who had this backstory that was clearly quite kind of messed up, so that they'd obviously been through some pretty traumatic things. But as they were hearing this story, they felt distinctly uncomfortable, like I was listening to something I didn't want to hear and would rather be anywhere else. And I had to ask why the writers put in such context. So here, we're getting a sense of what happens if you go a bit too far, right? That people are starting to become disengaged and questioning why such things are in the game in the first place. So how discomfort influences engagement, there were three themes here. The first was about how to process uncomfortable experiences. So clearly people needed a bit of space sometimes to step away and process their emotions. We also saw discomfort as contributing to richer forms of gameplay experience. So people did appreciate this sort of thing. So in the example here, they're actually in awe of the developers for making them feel such sort of complicated emotions as a result. And then finally, discomfort as a catalyst for reflection on life, the universe, and everything. So it's a bit of a long theme and a bit of a nod to Douglas Adams, but it's essentially trying to capture how games can sometimes get us thinking beyond the game itself around sort of societal issues and concerns. And this is an example of someone who came across a character in the game and started thinking about real-life villains. So how do people in real life become these horrible kind of people? What shapes them into being the hateful people they become? And they actually went on to do further research on this and look at how people join things like supremacist organisations. So, basically, one of the main takeaways from this is that gameplay can sometimes be surprisingly painful. People are experiencing a range of emotions, and some of these are quite intense. And discomfort, we would say, is characterised by this lack of positive emotion and also the intensity of the response. So you had people experiencing quite extreme anxiety, but also things like guilt and shame and sort of feeling of helplessness as well. So from a design point of view, I guess there's a need to think about how people process their emotions and to give them time to do that. Discomfort was also seen to be a part of a sort of richer kind of player experiences, but you can also go a bit too far here and you run the risk of pushing people away and then disengaging with the content potentially. And then finally, discomfort can facilitate transformative reflection in some cases. So this is something that the next presentation may tell you a little bit more about, but it's essentially something I'd like to see further work on as well, into how some people respond to these kind of episodes of discomfort by reflecting on wider things and wanting to find out more. And for some other people, that doesn't seem to be the case. So it'd be great to know a bit more about that. So thank you very much for listening.
Adrian Schneider from Queen's University in Canada. I wanted to ask it sounded like your recruiting procedure was largely going to be with the specialized subforums. It sounded like it was largely going to be getting fans of the game, so I'm interested that you got people responding with the unwanted, like, game, why, no, stop it. How often did that happen? Was that a lot of things where they thought, game, I wish you wouldn't do this, but I still like you, or did you get people that said, this is why I stopped playing this game?
Yeah, a little bit. I would say out of the 95, that wasn't a huge percentage of the people. So it was rarer that they said, it made me not want to play it anymore. But we did get a few responses like that. Primarily, it was, yes, I felt bad, but I either I liked other bits of the game more, or that was okay because it felt like a nice, interesting, complex experience.
Well, thank you.
Hi, Stuart Halifax, University Jean Moulin in Lyon, France. I wonder if you had any sort of ideas or stuff that came up in your data about differing reactions to when the player was forced to make a choice that they might have disliked versus the players watching a scene or something unfolding in front of them. Like the difference between the players having to make the difficult and the uncomfortable choices, whether just experiencing an uncomfortable situation.
I'd probably have to look at the data set again to be sure, but my impression is that if it was more the latter, then we were getting the theme of sort of the unwanted exposure. Like, I have no control and you're forcing this on me. Whereas I think what we're seeing more in the theme of the sort of responsibility but with limited power, that's the one where they have a choice, but they're not necessarily feeling like they've got much of a choice. But there's a distinction there, you're right. Yeah.
Thank you.
One last question, Max.
Max Berg, Eindhoven University of Technology. Thank you very much for your talk, Joe. Like coming back to kind of the recruitment group, basically. Mm-hmm. Can you describe a little bit more in depth who those people were? Like that's one part, like the individual difference actually, like in your group, like the descriptive data, basically.
Yeah.
I think that's one part, and the other part is actually like in terms of we find these effects. Okay, people have those experiences, is what the qualitative data tells us. Mm-hmm. But do we have a sense of quantification of that? Like how often does it occur? Is that like everyone affected by these stories, right? I need to buy into it, basically, is like what I'm saying.
Right, yeah. So a quick answer to your second part of that question is from this data, I wouldn't want to start quantifying it because it was a sort of opportunistic sample, right? So I suspect it happens more than we realise, but further work would need to be done that looks at the sort of numbers around that. For the first bit, I'm going to struggle to remember the details, but part of the reason we targeted sort of specific like sort of Reddit threads or particular game forums was because we had these 3 games pre-selected, so that's how we got our sample. In terms of how they differed, is that what you're asking, between the games?
Between the games, but also like what was that population like? How were they? What's their play experience? How much do they play?
Oh, okay.
How much
yeah.
do they like?
So there is a bit more of that in the paper. Generally speaking, they were quite regular sort of games players. That varied. Some a lot, some just regularly, but less often. Less long. They differed slightly. So the Fallout group was slightly older. The average age was about 30 for that. The other 2 was probably closer to sort of mid-20s. And it was the Darkest Dungeon group that was the most male biased. But there are more details in the paper if you want to check that out as well. Okay, thanks.
Thanks again to Joe and We stay with the same lab. Matthew is presenting the next paper on one of the baddies all along, moments that challenge a player's perspective.
Hello. Thank you very much for joining. I'm Matthew Whitby. I'm based in the University of York, and I'm presenting my sort of foundational research for my PhD project. So before I dive into exactly what a